canine German Shepherd refused to leave the elderly woman alone. When her husband learned the truth, he called the cops. Everyone in the neighborhood thought the elderly woman was just lonely, but no one expected the canine German Shepherd to show up out of nowhere and never leave her side. Day and night, the dog stood by her, alert, protective, and strangely emotional. At first, her husband thought it was just a passing thing, but when he found out why the dog wouldn't leave, he called the police. What happened next will break your heart and open your eyes. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. That way, you won't miss any of our powerful real-life inspired stories about loyalty, love, and second chances. Let's dive in. It started on a rainy Tuesday in late October, the kind of gray morning that clung to your skin and whispered that winter was coming early. Margaret Winslow, 74 years old and living in a quiet corner of Ashbury, Pennsylvania, was just finishing her morning tea when she heard a low, guttural sound outside. It wasn't thunder. It was deeper, closer, like someone or something breathing right against her front door. She opened it with a slow creak. There he was, a German Shepherd, soaked from the rain, eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that was almost human. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply stood there, ears twitching, tail still, as if he'd been waiting for her specifically. A faded, dirty collar hung around his thick neck. The only thing legible on the rusted tag was K9. "Where did you come from?" she asked, blinking against the rain. No answer, of course. But when she turned to step back into the house, the dog followed her. Margaret hesitated. She'd never owned a dog in her life, especially not one that looked like it had seen war. He had a scar along his left leg and a chipped tooth that caught the light when he panted. But something about him, his stillness, the deep grief in his amber eyes, made her nod. "All right, you can come in, just for a little while." The dog walked in without hesitation and sat at the base of her armchair as if it were his post. That evening, when her husband Leonard came home from his weekly poker game, he found the dog curled at Margaret's feet while she knitted. He dropped his keys, stunned. "What the hell is that doing here?" Margaret gave a nervous smile. "He was outside all morning. In the rain. I couldn't just leave him." Leonard, 78, a retired accountant with a stiff back and an even stiffer worldview, frowned. "He could be dangerous, Maggie." "He's not," she said, firmer than usual. "He hasn't left my side all day. I think he's protecting me." Leonard scoffed. "From what? This is Ashbury. The biggest threat around here is a raccoon in the trash." But that night, as Margaret got up to use the bathroom around 2:30 a.m., Leonard noticed something unsettling. The dog followed her, silent as a shadow. When she stopped, so did he. When she turned, so did he. And when she sat back on the bed, he positioned himself right in front of her, facing the door, like a soldier on guard. The next morning, Leonard decided enough was enough. "I'm calling animal control," he muttered, picking up the phone. Margaret turned pale. "No, don't." But Leonard had already dialed. Then something strange happened. As soon as Leonard picked up the receiver, the dog growled. Not loud, just enough. Enough for Leonard to feel the hairs on his arms stand up. The dog didn't move, didn't bare teeth, but his eyes, those deep, unblinking eyes, locked onto Leonard like he could read his intentions. Leonard froze. "You know what? I'll give it one more day," he said, hanging up the phone. But that night, everything changed. At 3:17 a.m., Leonard woke to the sound of Margaret's muffled cries from the living room. He rushed out of bed, heart pounding, and found her sitting on the couch, arms wrapped around the dog, shaking. The dog wasn't moving. He was pressed close to her, chest heaving, as if he knew she was about to break. Leonard's voice cracked. "What's going on, Maggie?" She didn't look up. "He knows, Leonard. He knows what happened that night. He was there." Leonard's face drained of color. "What are you talking about?" he asked. Margaret finally met his gaze, and what she said next made Leonard pick up the phone again, but not to call animal control. This time, he dialed the police. Officer Daniels arrived just before sunrise, his cruiser's headlights casting long, eerie shadows across the Winslow's narrow driveway. The blue and red flashes reflected off the kitchen window as Leonard opened the door, his hands visibly trembling. The officer, a tall man in his mid-30s with a calm voice and observant eyes, immediately noticed the large German shepherd sitting silently beside Margaret in the living room, still, watchful, and alert. "Sir, we received a call about a potential domestic disturbance?" Daniels asked carefully, glancing between the old couple. Leonard cleared his throat. "Yes, but it's more complicated than that." Margaret didn't tip. Her frail hands were wrapped in the thick fur of the dog's neck. Her face was pale, but her eyes were wet and open now. She wasn't confused. She wasn't weak. She looked ready. The officer stepped closer. "Ma'am, are you all right?" There was a long silence before she spoke. "I'm fine, but I need to tell someone what happened. And I think he brought the truth with him." Officer Daniels sat gently across from her, pulling out his notepad. "Go ahead, ma'am." Margaret's voice wavered. "It was 4 months ago, just after my birthday. Leonard had been different lately, irritable, suspicious. We argued a lot. And that night, I told him I wanted to visit my sister in Florida for a few weeks. He didn't like that. Said I was running away." Leonard, still standing behind the officer, stared at his wife. His face was unreadable. "That night," Margaret continued, "I fell. I still don't know how. I remember standing by the stairs, and then I was at the bottom. Something in my ribs cracked, my wrist, too." Officer Daniels narrowed his eyes. "Did someone push you?" Margaret hesitated. Before she could answer, the dog let out a low, mournful whimper and pressed closer to her legs. Her hand instinctively moved to the side of his face, calming him, and then, as if gathering strength from his presence, she whispered, "Yes." Daniels looked over his shoulder at Leonard. "Sir, did you?" Leonard snapped. "I didn't push her. She tripped. She was dizzy. She barely eats. And I panicked. I didn't call 911. I know I should have, but I was afraid they'd think I hurt her. She couldn't remember clearly anyway." Margaret's eyes filled again. "I remembered enough, Leonard." Daniel stood. "All right, let's slow down. I need both of you to remain calm, but I do have to report this and take a statement." Margaret nodded slowly. "I didn't speak up before because I didn't know what really happened. I thought maybe it was just an accident. But this dog, he came back for a reason." Daniels looked at the animal again. "Do you recognize him?" "No," she said. "But he acts like he's known me forever. He won't let Leonard near me. He walks me to bed, watches me cook, follows me from room to room. Like he's guarding me." Daniels approached the shepherd slowly. "May I check his tag?" The dog didn't growl or move, just stared at the officer with an expression that could only be described as patient. The collar was old, barely legible, but under the rust, Daniels made out a faint engraving, K9 Unit Shadow. Daniels exhaled. "I know that name." Margaret looked up. "You do?" "Yes. Shadow was retired from the force last year, served with the 23rd Precinct, trained for search and rescue and protective response. Disappeared during a flood mission. We thought he drowned." Margaret's voice broke. "Why would he come here?" Daniels looked around the room, then at Leonard, who had sunk onto the staircase in silent disbelief. "I don't know," he admitted. "But dogs like him, they sense things. He must have seen something that night. Maybe he followed you after the fall. Maybe he's been watching ever since." The silence was thick. Then Daniels turned to Leonard. "Sir, I'll need to file an official report based on what your wife shared and your own statement. I'll also be contacting Adult Protective Services to ensure she's safe going forward." Leonard didn't respond. He just stared at Shadow, the dog who now stood squarely between him and his wife, and Shadow didn't blink. For the next several days, the house felt like a battlefield, suspended in a silent truce. Leonard barely spoke. He kept to the upstairs study, curtains drawn, his footsteps light on the creaky floors. Margaret moved more slowly than usual, not because of fear, but because of the weight she'd finally let off her shoulders. Still, her chest tightened every time the phone rang or a car passed by the house. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she knew this was only the beginning. And Shadow never left her side. He followed her from the kitchen to the laundry room, down to the mailbox and back. He never barked, never begged for food or attention. He simply watched and waited. Margaret could feel it in her bones. This dog had come with a mission. Officer Daniels returned the following morning, this time with more information. "I spoke to my old captain," he said, taking a seat at the kitchen table. Shadow stood nearby, his eyes locked on the officer's hands, calm but alert. Turns out Shadow didn't just vanish. There was confusion during the flood rescue. His handler, Officer Reeves, was separated from him. They assumed Shadow tried to follow someone through the forest and got lost. "Wasn't he microchipped?" Margaret asked. Daniels nodded. "He was, but we think his collar was damaged, and he might have been knocked around in the current. The chip could have moved or failed. It's rare, but it happens. No one expected him to survive, let alone show up here." Margaret looked down at the dog. "Why me?" Daniels leaned forward. "That's what I came to talk about." He opened his folder and placed a photo on the table. It was a black and white image, grainy, taken from a traffic cam outside a pharmacy. A man stood holding the door open for an elderly woman. Just behind her, almost blending into the shadows of the alley, stood a large German shepherd. "That was you, 3 months ago," Daniels said softly. Margaret blinked. "What?" "According to the timestamp, it was 3 days after your fall. You'd gone out to fill your prescription for the cracked ribs. But look, he was already there. Shadow had started following you." Margaret stared at the image, her mouth parted slightly. "I didn't even know he was behind me." "Exactly. He was tracking you, watching, making sure you were safe. Shadow wasn't lost. He was choosing. And he chose you." For a moment, silence filled the room, interrupted only by the distant hum of a lawnmower next door. Then, Margaret whispered, "He saw what happened that night, didn't he?" Daniels didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled out a second photo. This one was from a neighbor's doorbell camera, slightly clearer. The timestamp read 2:14 a.m. The image showed Leonard stepping outside the house in a robe, barefoot, dragging a large black garbage bag to the edge of the property, and 2 yellow eyes glowing from the bushes. "He was already there," Daniels said. "He was watching your husband, tracking his behavior, and when he saw enough, he came to the door." Margaret felt her skin go cold. The dog shifted his weight slightly, leaning into her leg. She reached down, slowly, and stroked the thick fur behind his ears. Daniels stood up. "I don't think Shadow is just here because he bonded with you. I think he's making sure you're not harmed again. Canines aren't just trained for detection. They imprint. They remember. especially trauma. Margaret nodded. Her eyes were full of quiet understanding. Daniels looked around the house. Margaret, you can keep him. Shadow's officially retired. No one's claiming him. If you want him to stay, he's yours. A small tear slid down her cheek. He was mine the moment he stepped through that door. Daniels smiled gently. Then I'll make it official. Before leaving, he knelt and gave the dog a soft pat. Good boy, Shadow. You did your job. Now, go rest. But as Daniels walked down the path to his car, he looked back once and saw Shadow staring after him through the window, watching, guarding, still on duty. Because for Shadow, this wasn't over. Not yet. The air in the Winslow house grew heavier with each passing day. Though Officer Daniels had filed the report, no charges were brought against Leonard. There wasn't enough concrete evidence. Margaret hadn't officially accused him of anything physical, and Leonard denied everything beyond a bad judgment call. He remained in the house, distant but ever present, like a shadow clinging to the past. But Shadow, the real one, wasn't letting his guard down. He slept at the bedroom door, blocking anyone from entering while Margaret rested. He barked once, sharply, when Leonard tried to approach her in the kitchen to ask a question. And though Margaret tried to maintain a sense of peace, she could feel the walls between her and her husband hardening like cement. Then came the breaking point. It was a Sunday morning, cold and brittle. Margaret was folding laundry in the den when Leonard came down the stairs, holding a small cardboard box. I've had enough, he muttered. She looked up, confused. Enough of what? He dropped the box onto the coffee table with a thud. Inside were the remains of Shadow's old collar, torn, dirt-stained, but unmistakably the one he'd worn before Daniels gave him the new ID tag. Leonard's voice was shaking with rage. I found this buried behind the shed. You knew he was watching me. You let him stay here to spy on me. Margaret's voice remained calm. I didn't let him do anything. He chose to be here. He's destroying this house, Leonard growled. I can't move around without him glaring at me like I'm some kind of monster. Margaret stood, her hands folded over the towel she'd been folding. Maybe you should think about why that is. Leonard's face turned a deep red. You're poisoning everything between us. Over a dog. Shadow, lying quietly near the heater, lifted his head. Then Leonard said something he shouldn't have. I should have finished the job that night. The words fell like broken glass on the hardwood floor. Shadow stood instantly, ears forward, tail straight, teeth barely visible. A low rumble emerged from his chest. Margaret gasped. Leonard! But the damage was done. The canine moved, not to attack, but to block. He stood between Margaret and Leonard, his body rigid, eyes locked, ready. Not violent, but unshakably firm. A protector in the purest form. Leonard froze, sweat beading on his temple. Margaret's voice, soft but cold, sliced through the tension. That's it. You need to leave. Leonard scoffed, backing away from the dog. You'd throw away 50 years of marriage for this? Margaret stepped forward. No, Leonard. You threw it away the night you let me fall. The night you walked away and left me on that floor. This dog didn't ruin anything. He just reminded me what love is supposed to feel like. Safe, seen, protected. Leonard didn't answer. He turned, grabbed his coat, and walked out the front door, slamming it hard enough to rattle the walls. Shadow stood there for a long moment after he was gone, listening. Then slowly, he returned to Margaret's side and rested his head gently against her hip. She sank to the floor beside him, her hands trembling. I don't know how you knew, she whispered. I don't know how you found me, but thank you. Shadow didn't move. His eyes blinked slowly as if saying, You don't need to know. I was just doing my job. That evening, Margaret called Officer Daniels. He left, she said. For good this time. Daniel sighed. I'm glad you're safe. I'll check in on you in a few days. But if anything happens, don't hesitate to call. After hanging up, Margaret lit a fire and sat on the couch. Shadow curled at her feet, finally relaxing for the first time since arriving. Outside, the wind picked up, shaking the windows, but inside, the house had never felt warmer. Because Shadow was no longer just a visitor, he was family. And as long as he was there, Margaret would never be afraid again. 2 days after Leonard left, peace returned to the house. Or so it seemed. Margaret spent her mornings humming to old jazz records, folding laundry, and sipping tea with the windows open. The scent of cinnamon rolls filled the air on Wednesday morning as she stood in the kitchen, barefoot, gently swaying to Ella Fitzgerald. Shadow was beside her, as always, lying by the fridge, eyes closed but ears twitching at every sound. It had been calm, still, almost like normal life. But across the street, a neighbor had been watching. Mrs. Parker, the Winslows' neighbor of 20 years, was a retired nurse with a keen eye and a sharper memory. She had never been close to Margaret. Leonard always seemed to keep visitors away. But she noticed everything from her window. And when she saw Leonard return to the house late Tuesday night, just after midnight, she didn't ignore it, especially because he wasn't supposed to be there. She watched from behind the curtain as his car crawled up the driveway without headlights. He didn't knock, didn't call out, just stood in the dark, peering through the living room window before circling around back. And then she heard a low bark. Mrs. Parker's heart jumped. She couldn't see clearly, but she could hear the rumble, deep and threatening. Moments later, Leonard's silhouette vanished into the night. The next morning, she called Officer Daniels. I don't want to start trouble, she said, but that man came back last night, and I don't think it was for a visit. Daniels didn't hesitate. Thank you for calling, Mrs. Parker. You did the right thing. Within the hour, Daniels was at Margaret's door again. You didn't need to see anything last night? He asked gently. Margaret blinked. No. Shadow was restless around 1 a.m. He paced by the back door and wouldn't settle. I thought maybe a raccoon was out there. Daniels exchanged a look with Shadow, who now sat like a statue beside Margaret. Mrs. Parker saw Leonard. Said he parked without lights and looked through your windows. Margaret's hand trembled slightly. He promised he was done. I believe you, Daniels said. But I also believe Shadow. If he reacted, it wasn't random. These dogs don't make mistakes when it comes to threats. He stepped closer and lowered his voice. We're issuing a restraining order today. If he steps foot near this house again, it'll be a different kind of call. Margaret nodded, heart heavy. She glanced down at Shadow. He looked up at her, then nudged her wrist with his nose. A gentle reminder that she wasn't alone, but something still gnawed at her. Why would Leonard come back? She whispered. He said he was done. Daniels hesitated. Sometimes, when people lose control, they try to get it back, even if it means crossing the line. That night, Margaret double-checked every lock. She pulled the shades tighter. She placed a flashlight on the nightstand and made sure her cell phone was fully charged. And still, she didn't sleep. At 2:04 a.m., she heard it. A soft click. Then, the unmistakable creak of the back gate. Shadow was up in a flash. No sound, no hesitation. He moved to the back door, tail raised, shoulders tight, teeth bared. His growl this time was not subtle. It was primal, a warning from deep inside his chest. Margaret grabbed the phone. Before she could even dial, a shadow moved past the window, fast. Then, the gate slammed shut. Shadow barked once, loud, sharp, enough to wake the street. And it worked. Lights came on next door. A motion sensor triggered in Mrs. Parker's yard, and the intruder, whoever it was, vanished into the darkness. When the police arrived 15 minutes later, Leonard's car was found parked at the edge of a nearby street. The engine was still warm. He wasn't inside. But Shadow had done enough. He had protected her again, not just with strength, but with presence. Daniels looked at Margaret as the cruiser lights flickered in her driveway. "He won't try this again," he said. "Not with a canine like Shadow on watch." Margaret wrapped her robe tighter. "He shouldn't have tried at all." She knelt beside Shadow, brushing her fingers along his neck. "You're not just a protector," she whispered. "You're my angel." And Shadow, silent and loyal, sat down at her side, eyes fixed on the door. By the following week, Margaret's house had become a quiet fortress. The restraining order had been formally served to Leonard, and though he hadn't made another appearance, Margaret couldn't shake the memory of that click at the back gate. How deliberate it had sounded in the middle of the night. Her hands trembled less now. Her sleep had grown deeper, but she still checked every lock twice before bedtime. Through it all, Shadow remained her constant. The retired K9 had made the transition from law enforcement to guardian angel, as if it had been his true calling all along. Margaret often found herself talking to him. Not in that absent-minded way people do with pets, but with intention, as if he understood every word. And perhaps he did, because Shadow didn't just listen. He responded, with a gentle nudge of his nose, a tilt of the head, or that watchful, timeless gaze. One chilly afternoon, Margaret sat in the garden, wrapped in her favorite knit shawl. Autumn leaves rustled around her, and the sky above was the color of pewter. Shadow lay at her feet, ears twitching at the distant sounds of the neighborhood. "I keep wondering why," she murmured, running her fingers through his fur. "Of all the homes you could have found, why mine?" Shadow blinked slowly. "Maybe God knew I needed someone like you," she said, her voice catching. "Not someone who'd pity me or push me around, just someone who'd stay." The next morning, Officer Daniels returned with someone new. "This is Captain Reeves," he said, as a broad-shouldered man in a navy jacket stepped forward. "Shadow's original handler." Reeves's eyes glistened the moment he saw the dog. "Shadow?" he whispered, crouching down. The dog stood up, ears forward. For a long, breathless second, there was no reaction. Then Shadow approached Reeves slowly, cautiously, and sat in front of him. Their eyes met. No tail wag, no bark, just recognition. A heavy silence passed between them. "I thought I lost you, buddy," Reeves said softly, placing a hand on Shadow's neck. "You disappeared during the flood. I waited, searched the river for days." Margaret stood on the porch, her hands clenched over her chest. "I didn't know you were looking for him." Reeves nodded. "Every day. We served together for 3 years. I lost my leg in that rescue. I thought I'd lost my partner too." He looked at Margaret. "But he found you instead." Daniels spoke quietly. "Captain Reeves wanted to visit, not reclaim. Shadow's officially retired. He belongs here now if you'll still have him." Margaret's eyes filled. "He's more than welcome. He's part of me now." Reeves smiled through the emotion. "Then thank you for taking care of him." Before he left, Reeves knelt once more beside Shadow and whispered something only the dog could hear. Shadow licked his hand, a rare gesture, gentle and full of meaning, and then returned to Margaret's side without hesitation. After the visit, something changed. Shadow grew more at ease. He slept deeper. He played in the backyard with a stick Margaret had started throwing for him. Small sprints at first, then full-out runs, ears flapping like flags in the wind. It was the first time Margaret had seen him act like a regular dog. As fall began to turn to winter, the townspeople took notice. People walking by smiled when they saw the elderly woman and her loyal dog side by side on the porch. Children called him the soldier dog. Some neighbors even dropped off dog treats at the gate. Shadow had become more than a protector. He was a legend. But to Margaret, he remained something simpler and deeper. That night, as she curled up in bed, Shadow curled onto the rug beside her. The room was quiet, save for the tick of the old wall clock and the wind whispering outside. Margaret turned off the lamp and whispered into the dark, "You saved my life, Shadow, and I'll spend the rest of mine making sure you never doubt how much that means." The dog stirred, lifted his head slightly, and then laid it down again with a soft exhale. He had completed one mission and begun another. The first snowfall arrived silently. Overnight, Ashbury transformed from shades of amber to a soft, silvery white. Margaret opened the curtains to a world blanketed in quiet purity. Her porch, her lawn, her rose bushes, all covered in snow like icing on a memory. And there, at the center of it all, stood Shadow. His thick coat dusted with snowflakes, his eyes scanning the horizon, body still as ever. Winter didn't slow him. If anything, it brought out something even deeper in him, a kind of still majesty, like he belonged to the snow. That morning, Margaret poured her coffee a little slower. The ache in her hip was more stubborn than usual, and her fingers felt stiff. She smiled despite it. For the first time in years, her mornings began not in fear, but in peace. She walked to the door, cracked it open, and called softly, "Shadow, sweetheart, come inside." He trotted in, shaking snow from his back like a young pup. Margaret laughed gently as she wiped his head with a towel. "You were born for this weather," she whispered. In early December, Officer Daniels stopped by once more, this time without a file or clipboard. Just a box wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "Holiday gift," he said. "For the both of you." Margaret opened it to find a large frame. Inside was a newspaper clipping. The headline read, "K9 Hero Finds New Purpose in Protecting Elderly Widow." And below it, a picture of Shadow sitting proudly on her porch, Margaret beside him in her chair, one hand on his back. "I didn't know anyone wrote about us," she said softly. Daniel smiled. "The town did. People were moved. You two gave them something real, something to believe in again." Margaret hung the frame in her living room, just above the fireplace. Weeks passed, the days shortened. But inside the Winslow home, warmth thrived. Then, one evening, something changed. Margaret was setting the table for dinner, baked chicken and sweet potatoes. Her favorite, when she noticed Shadow hadn't come to the kitchen. He always followed her. Always. She walked into the living room. He was lying on his side near the fire, breathing low, too slow. "Shadow," she whispered, kneeling. His eyes opened, soft, tired. She sat beside him, her heart suddenly pounding. No, not yet." She stroked his neck, whispering to him as tears welled in her eyes. "Please, you just got here. You can't go now." Shadow blinked once, then again, his breath shallow. She called Daniels, then Reeves. Neither answered fast enough. Margaret didn't wait. She bundled a blanket, carefully lifted Shadow's massive body with trembling strength, and placed him in the back seat of her car. At the emergency vet, they worked quickly, gently. The doctor spoke in calm tones, but Margaret could read between the lines. "Age, ma'am," he said. "His heart's been slowing down. Sometimes they push through pain to stay near the ones they love." Margaret sat beside him for over an hour, stroking him, singing softly. When Reeves arrived, he knelt down quietly and placed a medal, Shadow's service medal, on the blanket near the dog's paw. "I never got to thank you," he whispered. Shadow lifted his head one last time and looked at both of them. There was no fear in his eyes. Only peace only love. And then, like a soft wind through an open field, he let go. The town mourned. A small ceremony was held. Margaret insisted on something simple: a handmade plaque, a folded flag, and a place under the willow tree in her backyard. It read, Shadow, Canine Unit, Protector, Friend. You were love in its bravest form. Officer Daniels gave the eulogy. Captain Reeves saluted. Margaret didn't speak, not because she couldn't, but because she knew Shadow had already said everything he needed to. Without words, without promises, just presence. Now, every morning, Margaret steps out with her tea, stands by the willow, and smiles. Sometimes, when the wind is right, she swears she hears him, the soft thud of paws, the low rumble of a protective growl. She doesn't question it, because she knows. Once a protector, always a protector, and Shadow had made his last promise. He kept it.